In 1883, the scholar John Bateman published the book that was the culmination of his life work, The Great Landowners of Great Britain and Ireland. And in it, Bateman estimated the levels of land ownership and the concentration of land ownership in the United Kingdom. And his conclusion was that the UK and Ireland, that half of the land was owned by just 4,000 wealthy families, and that 95% of the UK's population in the 1880s owned no land. While we are, without doubt, fortunate in the UK to have our national parks that give us access, in the case of England, to 10% of our nation's land, 20% for Wales, 7% for Scotland. These preserved and protected areas disguise the reality that land ownership in Britain is both enormously concentrated and frighteningly secretive. Part of the process that led to the concentration of land ownership was linked to another process that was taking place in exactly the same decades, but thousands of miles away, on other continents. A process that also resulted in other land being taken away from other people and placed in the hands of the few. Because one of the sources of the private wealth that allowed so much of the British and Irish countryside to be consolidated into giant estates, the process that helped place so much of natural Britain beyond the reach of many millions of urbanized working-class city dwellers, part of that source came from the imperial realm. Britain's imperial project regularly involved the displacement of indigenous people from the land of the islands of the Caribbean, the plains of North America, later in the Pacific and elsewhere. Seized, redistributed to white settlers, this once indigenous land was given over to the rearing of sheep in Australia, to the growing of cash crops, monoculture, sugar, tobacco, and others in the Americas. This vast concentration of wealth generated from the 17th to the 19th centuries on those colonial frontiers helped generate successive generations of newly enriched elites. The West India planters who returned from the Caribbean, the so-called nabobs, the winners in the lottery between huge fortunes or death from disease that was offered by the East India Company. The poorest of them became a new squireocracy. The wealthiest of them became a new aristocracy, or just as often, they married in to the old aristocracy. Remember, and this is an easy point to make here in Bristol, an Atlantic-facing port whose ships transported 500,000 people into slavery between 1660 and 1807. The empire happened here, not just there. Because the wealth of empire, in many cases, generated indirectly or directly through the displacement of black and brown people on colonial frontiers, enabled the new rich to buy up land here in the UK. In doing so, they added to the capital the purchasing power, which was one of the push factors of enclosure and privatization, that in turn combined with the extraordinarily powerful pull factors of industrial employment in the booming cities. And this is where the interconnectedness, the intersectionality between the challenge of improving connectedness to the natural world and history can be seen. The biggest mass organization in the United Kingdom, with over 5.3 million members, is the National Trust. The National Trust has more than 27 times the members of the Conservative Party. When the National Trust, an organization that has within its care 250,000 hectares of land, in recent years sought merely to investigate the connections between the property in its care and historic slavery and colonialism. For this expansion of knowledge, it was subjected to an ongoing campaign of abuse, intimidation, and harassment by a shadily funded pressure group. Opponents of the trust often seemed equally happy to express their frustration at the trust's commitment to environmental management of the land in its care. The UK faces an uphill task. If we are to improve levels of connectedness to nature, to repair our biodiversity, and despite the still vast concentration of land in private ownership, despite our long history of being a highly urbanized society, make nature available to all of us, from every community and every background, then we need to reject the politicization and the demonization of the work of imprinting the history of all of us onto the natural landscape. We need to defend our national organizations, defend the importance of being honest about our history and how it has shaped our modern environment. We need to do this because the fastest growing populations in our country are those for whom the history of the empire is family history. We need to do it in the interests of all of us. Thank you very much.